The title of tonight's webinar is A Beginner's Guide to EBVs. I was originally going to call the presentation EBVs for Dummies, because they call a lot of things that. But when I got to think about it, EBVs isn't necessarily I don't want to present simple information, but I want to hopefully create an understanding of EBVs by kind of starting at the beginning. So the first thing we need to talk about is, what is an EBV? Of course, it's an acronym. We live by acronyms. The acronym stands for Estimated Breeding Value. What an EBV does is it quantifies the genetic merit or value of an animal for breeding. It's actually a mathematical, computer-generated prediction of an animal for economically important traits. So it's a number. Anyone familiar with EPDs, which stands for expected progeny difference, those are what's used in beef cattle. An EBV is simply twice the value of an EPD because we're talking about the progeny, whereas an EBV we're talking about the parent. We can calculate an EBV, we meaning the computer program, for any trait for which we can collect data, for which we can quantify. So some of them are direct measurements like weight, but I know they're working on an EBV in Australia for lambing ease. Obviously that would be a kind of like a scale. But anything that we can collect data on, anything that we can quantify, they can calculate an EBV on. All right, another acronym that I'm going to use throughout my presentation is NSIP. NSIP stands for the National Sheep Improvement Program. NSIP is the organization that provides EBVs for the U.S. sheep and goat industry. It doesn't do the data analysis or processing. A couple years ago, they contracted the data processing to Sheep Genetics in Australia, also commonly referred to as Lamb Plan. So I may also use that term as well. There's also a Kid Plan. Now, just every other animal industry, beef cattle, dairy cattle, pigs, as well as other countries' sheep industries have similar programs as NSIP. Of course, Australia's is called Lamb Plan. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you're a dairy producer of sheep and goats, this isn't really the program for you because it's going to focus predominantly on meat and fiber and not on milk production. So that's where DHIA can be used. We have dairy goat farms that are on that program. We don't have a lot of sheep dairies in the United States, but and I don't know if they're on DHIA yet, but that's the program that they're going to look to make genetic improvement in their flocks and herds. So EBVs, NSIP, predominantly for meat sheep, wool sheep, and fiber goats. So if you wonder what are some of the traits that EBVs can be calculated for, these are the ones that are currently available to producers in the United States. Reproductive traits, things like number of lambs born, number of lambs weaned, all of these traits have acronyms, so we live off of acronyms, and sometimes when you see them it gets confusing, but they're really just obviously a shorter way to describe these traits. We can do one for scrotal circumference. In terms of growth traits, we've got birth weight, weaning weight. Maternal weaning weight is simply the portion of the weaning weight that the dam gets credit for. So it's an estimate or a measure of milk production. And then we have a post-weaning weight and we have yearling weight. The weaning weights can be at different ages depending on the breed or what the breed has chosen. For example, it's usually 60 days for breeds like Katahdin and Polypay, and it may be later for some of the sheep out west, the range sheep. The wool traits or fleece traits that there can be EBVs for are fleece weight, fleece diameter, and staple length. After each of the acronyms, you can see the unit in which the EBV is based. So for fleece weight, because we don't have a big sheep industry like Australia, it's actually not in pounds or kilograms, it's actually in percent. So what percent above the average? Parasite resistance, which are fecal or worm egg counts, these are also percentage and not number of eggs. We also have carcass traits, the depth of the loin muscle. A lot of times in this country they do the area. Well, for EBVs it's the depth, and then also the fat depth. In that pink box are indexes. What an index is it's a combination of traits. Different breeds or production systems may make selection decisions on these index. For example, the Carcass Plus index would include things like, put an emphasis on things like growth rate, loin depth, and fat depth. So that would be for a breed, say, like Suffolk. Hair sheep producers, basically Katahdin breeders, have created an index for the traits they think are most important for their breed. The maternal index is for the maternal breeds of sheep, something like the Polypay. It's simply that they're the wool breeds. And then the range index is still for a maternal breed, but one in which wool production is important. Targhee would be one of the breeds that uses this. We don't have any indexes for meat goats, but that's because we don't have very many meat goat herds participating, but this is something that could be created. And it would probably be different than these in that it'd probably be a combination. We don't have that many meat goat breeds. They're all going to be evaluated together, so it's probably going to be a combination or kind of a dual purpose type index if we had it for meat goats. EBVs are numbers. For those of you who like math, who like statistics, who like numbers, this could become like a religion for you. It's really interesting to get this information, to make purchasing and selection decisions on it. So there's different things that you have to interpret when you look at an EBV. This box shows an EBV for weaning weight. So the WWT is the acronym for weaning weight. You notice it's in kilograms. Well, that's because the Australians use the metric system. So when their weight measurements, they're going to be in the metric system. Simple enough, a kilogram is 2.2 pounds. So it's very easy. You just divide by 2.2. The value of the breeding value is actually that 3.0. That means this ram, his offspring, he will pass half of his genetics on to his offspring, so they'll be 1.5 kilograms heavier than the average. The 94% is the accuracy of that breeding value. How confident are we that that's a good value and it represents the animal's true genetic merit? We'll get into a little bit more details on some of these things as we go along. If you're a breeder, this is the type of data that you would get back from LambPlan or Australia based on the numbers that you submit. This is actually for a Suffolk breeder. And if you look across the top, you can see the acronyms for those traits. We've got birth weight, weaning weight, post-weaning weight, and then we have fat depth and loin depth, and those are both in millimeters, again, the metric system. The next is number of lamb born and number of lamb weaned. Below those numbers, in that kind of lighter gray color, is the accuracy figure. All the big long numbers at the ends are the IDs of the animals, the sire, the dam, and you don't have to be real concerned about those. They look kind of overwhelming, but they're just the ID, and they have specific rules for how they identify it. But this would be a typical printout that you would get if you were a breeder. If you went to buy a ram, and the rams or rams or ewes had EBVs, excuse me. This might be what's in the sale catalog. This is from the Center of the Nation sale, which is an NSIP sale in Iowa, multi-breeds, and this is for a couple of Polypay ewes. This is a lot easier to read. You can see the table. If we look at number 14, she has a birth weaning weight of 1, which means she will pass half of that on to her offspring, and they will be a half a pound heavier than the average for the breed. Then you see maternal weaning weight, post-weaning weight, number of lambs born, number of lambs weaned, and then that MI, that's the maternal index. So that's one of those indexes. So this ewe is a 12.4% higher indexing than the average in that breed. So that's kind of what these numbers mean. They can be, a lot of sale catalogs, if they're selling animals that are in the program, they will show this data. There are two different kinds of EBVs. There's what's called flock EBVs. This is what you get when your flock is not connected to other flocks. For example, let's say you were the only one who had Jacob sheep in NSIP. You wouldn't be able to connect to other flocks because there aren't any. That's a disadvantage, and we'll talk about that. But if you don't have any connection, you're still going to get EBVs on the animals in your flock, and you're going to be able to compare the animals in your flock, and you're going to be able to select the best animals in your flock. You probably think you already are, but an EBV is going to take in so much more into consideration than what you and I do when we make simple selection decisions. If your flock has genetic linkages, it shares genetics with other NSIP flocks. For example, say you're a Katahdin breeder, then you're going to get across flock EBVs. And usually when we say an EBV, we usually mean the across flock EBVs, because the whole value of this program is to be able to compare animals in one flock or herd to animals in another. So NSIP EBVs allow us to compare animals from one farm with animals from another farm, regardless of where that farm is located and regardless of how they raise them. Maybe this farm creep feeds them, maybe this farm doesn't. Doesn't matter. EBVs are comparisons to the average. They're not going to predict what the weaning weight is going to be in the absolute number. They're not going to say, well, these lambs are going to weigh 60 pounds. It's going to be a comparison to the average. 5 pounds heavier, 3 pounds heavier. Okay, I want to talk just a little bit about some of the concepts that go into understanding EBVs and how they're calculated. All animals have a set of characteristics that represent their value to a producer. There's things that we like about the animal. There's things about the animal. How many babies did the female have? What's the birth weight of that buck? What was his weaning weight? What's the fiber diameter of that ram's fleece? How deep is his loin? What's his fecal egg count? Frame size? Many, many, many traits. These traits that make up this animal are called the phenotype. It's called the animal's phenotype. We can measure these traits. Sometimes they're just traits that we visually observe. But that's what makes the animal what it is, and it's his phenotype. The phenotype is the result of both genetics, which is genotype, as well as the environment in which it was or is raised. This is a picture of a merino ram in South Africa. What we see there, that ram, what he looks like, what his fiber diameter is, what his weaning weight is, again, that's his phenotype. It's made up of his genetics, his DNA, and influenced by the environment in which he lived. That's the environment in which he lived. This was taken, I guess, in May, which was coming on winter in South Africa. Obviously not green and lush like some of the pastures that we have here in where I live in the Mid-Atlantic area. So his environment is going to influence his phenotype. Most of the differences we see between animals is the result of environment, management, or chance. Probability. Remember, genetics is about probability. What is the chance that we're going to get that? And we're trying to increase the probability that we're going to get better animals and decrease the probability that we're going to get poor animals. So about 75 to 95%, 90% of the differences we see are the result of the environment or management. All too often, people will buy I'm going to buy that buck or that ram. He's really big. I can tell you, you're buying that producer's management and environment in most cases. Feed them more, they grow more. Okay? The differences we're interested in is what's left, and that's due to genetics. And sometimes that number may seem real small, 10%. That's a really small number. But unlike management, unlike the environment, genetics is permanent and it's compounding. It builds, it keeps building. What EBVs do is they allow us to identify the portion of those differences that are due to genetics. And they're far more accurate than on-farm or centralized testing. If you weigh your lambs or kids and do adjusted weaning weights and make selection decisions on that basis, that's a good thing. But if you want to get more accurate, you'll do EBVs. If you put a buck in our performance test or a ram in a performance test, that's a good thing too. But you're going to be much more accurate in your selection decisions if you'll take that next step and use EBVs in one way or another. Okay, I want to talk about how EBVs are calculated, not about the math, but what goes in to determining an EBV. What EBVs have to do is they have to account for the sources of variation in a particular trait. We'll get into a little bit more detail about the environment and how it affects an animal's phenotype, and then some of the genetic variation, heritability, genetic relationships, and genetic correlations. As we've already mentioned, environment is a very large source of variation, up to 95%. And what we mean by the production environment, how is that animal raised? Is he raised in a pen? Is he raised in a pasture? If it's pasture, what kind of pasture? What type of grazing system? What's the diet that that animal receives? How that animal performs can be very much affected by pasture quality, by diet. What's the health protocol? Do you deworm all the lambs at weaning? Do you give them a coccidiostat? What do you do to manage those animals? And then management itself. If I check my ewes and does frequently during the lambing kidding season, I might expect it to save more lambs and kids than if I didn't. So all of those things are going to affect the performance of my livestock. Then there's some fixed effects that doesn't necessarily involve us and our decisions, but nonetheless affect the environment of that lamb or kid. And we use adjustment factors or NSIP EBVs use adjustment factors to correct for those fixed effects for differences in the environment. When we're talking about meat goats or sheep and goats, what we're talking really about here is the type of birth and the type of rearing, single, twin, triplet. We expect a single lamb to grow faster than a twin or triplet. We expect a 4-year-old ewe to produce a better lamb than a yearling or a 9-year-old ewe. And so we have adjustment factors that will account for those differences. Basically adjust them to a kind of a common birth and rearing type. A single, born and raised a single, raised by a doe or ewe between the ages of 3 and 6. These adjustment factors are the same ones you use if you do adjusted weaning weights. So if you're doing adjusted weaning weights in your farm, you're using the same adjustment factors. You're using probably standard ones. With EBVs, we're able to develop ones that are specific to a breed. For example, Katahdins now have their own EBVs. Some traits are affected more by genetics than other traits. There's a larger portion that's genetics as compared to other traits. They have a smaller portion of genetics and a larger portion of the environment. The amount of variation that's due to genetics, or the proportion of genetics, is called heritability. And different traits have different heritabilities. Generally speaking, the reproductive traits are the lowest, between 5 and 20%. The number of lambs born, as you can see in this picture, is only about 10% heritable. So the differences we see in a flock, in a population, 90% of the differences are due to environment, things such as season, things such as flushing, the age of the ewe, nutrition, body condition score. All of those things have a big influence on reproductive rate. It's only about 10% heritable. Growth rates, moderately to highly, much higher heritability. Carcass traits, again, higher in heritability. Wool traits, probably even a little bit better. Lactation traits, again, higher than reproductive rate. Parasite resistance is heritability on that's pretty good. EBVs are actually most powerful for the traits that are very difficult to measure and have low heritabilities, such as the reproductive traits. It's very hard to select for the reproductive traits on a farm. We don't select for them at all in our buck and ram tests. EBVs are really the only way to identify the sires that produce the best females for breeding. When EBVs are calculated, they also account for relationships between animals. An offspring will inherit 50% of its genetics from its sire and 50% of its genetics from its mother. So it'll have 50% of their genetics. Half-sibs, 25% of their genes will be in common. First cousins, about 12.5%, but even distant related animals still share some genes. And it is all these relationships and the data from all these different animals that goes into an EBV that makes it a more accurate method of selection. EBVs also consider genetic correlations. Most of the traits that we're interested in are not controlled by a single gene. They are controlled by multiple genes. And some of those genes affect other traits. So very often we have correlations between traits. A positive correlation means that an increase in that trait will result in an increase in another trait. Okay, perfect example is birth weight and weaning weight. Higher weaning weights are correlated with heavier birth weights are correlated with heavier weaning weights. They're also correlated with heavier post-weaning weights and heavier yearling weights. The genetic correlation is about 0.3. Correlations run between 0 and 1. Sometimes traits have a negative correlation. Sometimes that negative correlation is a good thing, though, and sometimes it's a bad thing. Staple length and fiber diameter are negatively correlated. As a fleece fiber gets longer, it tends to get coarser. Now, if you're a fine wool producer, that's a significant factor because fine wool brings more money in the commercial market. So as they increase staple length, there's the potential to reduce or to increase fiber diameter. And so when using EBVs for selection, they have to keep their eye on both of those traits because you don't want to improve one at the detriment to another. EBVs are going to consider these genetic correlations when they calculate that figure. So what an EBV is actually calculated from, it's calculated from the data for the trait that you're measuring. Let's say this ram had when it was younger, it had a weaning weight of 70 pounds. It had an adjusted weaning weight of 85 pounds. That's going to go into the calculation. But his birth weight, his post-weaning weight, his yearling weight in this case would also go into the calculation of that weaning weight. So the more data you can provide of related data is going to improve the accuracy, the confidence in that EBV. For example, if I just wanted to record weaning weights, I didn't want to record post-weaning weights, my data probably wouldn't be as accurate. So the more data I can include, the better. Then we add the data from the relatives, the sire, the dam, the siblings, the half-sibs, the cousins, the distant relatives. The more, the better. So on our farm, when we select a lamb or kid because it's born a twin, a lot of times we're just selecting on that one animal's data. We really need to be selecting on the family and all these other relatives. We can try to do that on the farm, but EBVs are going to be calculated, scientifically. They're going to factor all that information in. And of course, the EBV has to consider heritability. That has to factor into the calculations as well. So all of these things go into calculating that EBV. So again, even if you don't enroll your flock in EBV in NSIP, even if you don't buy animals that has this data, think about these things as you make your selection decisions. Don't select a lamb because he's born a twin. look at the other relatives. What has his mother done every year? What has her sister done or her half-sib done? You know, try to bring in more relatives. Consider other data as you make that selection decision. Again, just to re-emphasize, EBVs are comparisons. They're not, again, they're not going to tell you how many lambs a ewe is going to have. They're not going to tell you what the weaning weight is going to be. They're going to tell you how they're going to compare to the average. In the case of your flock, those flock EBVs, the EBV is going to be in relationship to the average in your flock. If you have genetic linkages with other flocks, with other producers, then that EBV is going to compare you to the breed average. You have a ewe that has a number of lambs born EBD of 10, that means her lambing rate is 10% above the average for that breed. The strength of EBVs is dependent on three concepts that I want to talk about. The first one is contemporary groups. And these aren't just important to producers who use EBVs, these are important to you when you make selection decisions on a farm. Kind of simply stated, they allow us to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. So a contemporary group is basically a management group. It's a group of lambs or kids that have been born within 45 days of each other. That's more than 2, almost 3 heat cycles in sheep. And they've been managed in the same way. Same pen, pasture, same feed, same health protocol. Same. For the purposes of EBVs, in order to have good contemporary groups of animals that we can compare, we need to have at least 2 sires. We need to use 2 rams, 2 bucks. And we need to have enough offspring. Usually at least 20. Sometimes they'll say 15 is enough. The bigger that group is, the better the data is, the more accurate the data is. Here's some examples of what aren't contemporary groups, meaning you cannot compare these animals, even on your own farm. Different breeds. They must be the same breed. EBVs are within breed comparisons. In cattle, and Jeff can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they're starting to be able to do comparisons across breeds. But again, with sheep, it's just within breed. In goats, if we get more herds involved, it will start out with all the breeds together, and if there got to be enough participants, they may be able to separate it out by breed. If these animals are born more than 45 days apart, you're not going to do an early January group of lambs with a late March group of lambs. They're completely different. You're only going to be able to compare the ones in the same management group. One of the challenges I have, and I just filled out my application for NSIP today, and I'm going to mail it tomorrow, is I like to separate out the dams who have triplets from the dams who have twins, and I like to separate out the yearlings, and I like to feed them differently. When I do that, I create different contemporary groups. I can no longer compare the lambs in those production environments. If you've got lambs or kids that are creep fed, you can't compare them to those that aren't creep fed. They're not being raised the same. You have them in 2 different locations. Even if they're born at the same time, even if they're both not creep fed, you cannot compare them. Anybody that gets fostered onto another ewe or doe, they cannot go in that contemporary group. Any offspring that you remove for artificial rearing, again, it's a completely different environment. None of these are good contemporary groups. Contemporary groups are the same. They're managed, fed the same. So again, even if you don't do EBVs, when you make your own selection decisions, make sure you're comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges. Okay, the next thing is genetic linkages. And what a linkage is, it's when animals share some percentage of the same genetics. So I have some of the same genetics in my flock that a flock in Virginia has, or a flock in Missouri has. By having these linkages, it allows us to compare the performance of animals in different flocks. Genetics have to be in this flock, in this flock, in this flock, the same genetics so that we can compare them. That's how it works. The best way to get linkages is for the same flocks to use the same rams in 2 or more flocks or herds. So one of the best things you can do if this sparks an interest in you is to work with other producers and create those linkages, share rams. At least buy sons or buy rams, but ideally those same rams being used in different flocks and herds, and ideally in different production systems. This farm is pasture-based and doesn't creep feed. This one's a winter lambing, this one's a spring lambing. Getting the same genetics in different production environments. That's how we improve the accuracy of the data, and that's how again, we're looking for comparisons of differences. We expect grain-fed to grow faster than pasture-raised. That does not mean they're better. It is only by EBVs that we can kind of account for those environmental differences and find out what the true genetic value of those animals is. The next concept that's really important are accuracy values. And what these are is they're a measure of the confidence in that EBV. How representative is that EBV of the animal's true breeding value? Okay, remember, genetics is about predictions. So if you look at this data here, again, the big numbers are the EBVs, the smaller numbers in italics are the accuracy figures. Accuracies range from 0 to 100. Obviously, the closer it is to 100, the better. If we look at that animal on the top, the accuracy is lowest for the number of lambs born. It is highest for post-weaning weight and birth weight. The higher the accuracy, the more confidence we have. Now, these accuracy values are affected by a lot of different things. How much data we have. EBVs, the power is in the data. More flocks, more animals, more data. All of that makes it more powerful. Okay? How heritable the trait is. One of the reasons number of lamb born is lower accuracy is the heritability of number of lamb born. Again, that's only 10%. Remember, it's a lowly heritable trait. The weaning weights, they're much higher. The loin depth, the PEMD, I'm not even sure what that acronym stands for, but that's the loin depth, and that's 95%. The loin depth's about 35% heritable in sheep. And the size of the group in which the animal was compared, again, those contemporary groups. Okay, hopefully that gives you a little bit of understanding of the complexity that goes into calculating EBVs. Thankfully, that's what computers are for. They do the calculations, but it gives you some idea, maybe when you make your own selection decisions, that it can be very complex, and that the more you can consider some of those things, the more accurate your selection will be. So who should enroll in NSIP? Who should get these EBVs calculated? It's primarily for purebred producers. NSIP cannot yet deal with crossbred animals. It's for purebred producers, seed stock producers, high percentage of a certain breed. Thank you, Rick. I just happened to look at that in the corner of my eye. Producers who are large enough so that they can use multiple sires. You need to be big enough so that you can and are willing to use at least 2 sires, and you have enough lambs to create meaningful contemporary groups. Yeah, you can have a contemporary group of 3, but you know what? It's better if it's 20, it's better if it's 30. Okay? You have to do single sire matings. You have to know who the sire is. Okay? That's essential. You have to be able to provide pedigree data. You have to be willing to measure, record, and submit the required data. Some of you are already doing it. So if you're already doing it, you might want to consider taking the next step. And then probably just as important is you have to have, or you have to be willing to create linkages with other flocks. Without the linkages, you still get within flock EBVs, and that still can be beneficial to you. But the true power is being able to link to other breeders and to be able to make comparisons to other flocks and herds. Otherwise, there absolutely is no way to make those comparisons. Bigger is not better, because bigger is probably a result of the environment. Now, just to give you an idea of the current enrollment in NSIP, we had somebody asked about how many flocks were enrolled. I went onto the NSIP website to look at the number of flocks. They do it with a map, with a little pointer on a map, and I tried to count the little pointers. So these are the breeds that are most active: Dorset, Hampshire, Katahdin, Polypay, Shropshire, Suffolk, and Targhee. Katahdin, as you can see, has the most number of flocks enrolled, but I believe the Targhee, as a range breed, has more sheep enrolled. So number of flocks is important, but also the more sheep, the better. All the rest of the breeds, not every breed, but a lot of other breeds have fewer than 3 flocks enrolled. So when the question was asked about Texel, I think they have about 3 flocks. There's some breeds that only have 1. If you're the only one in your breed, again, you can still get within your own flock EBVs. Current enrollment of meat goat herds is only 5. So we need to do a lot of work to try to get more meat goat herds enrolled. Can producers with small flocks enroll in NSIP? Well, anyone can certainly enroll their flock or herd in NSIP. And there's some things that small flocks can do. One, they can purchase or lease rams that have EBVs. Even if they're small, they should use 2 breeds or sires for breeding. On the right is an example if you had 30 ewes of the same breed. You split that flock in half and breed to 2 different sires. I'm saying you get about 25 lambs. Maybe you get 20, maybe you get 30. It depends on your breed. That would work. 30 ewes is not a large flock. So you can do it with 30. Can you do it with less? Sure. You're going to get those, you're still going to want to use 2 sires, and you'd like to have at least 15 lambs, but you can do it. What's going to happen with small flocks is their rate of genetic progress is going to be slower. Again, they don't have the numbers. And in some cases, in those small flocks, especially if they're not of those previous breeds, they may just get the flock EBVs instead of the across flock if they don't have connections with other flocks. But again, I'll say one of the best things you can do if you have a breed that doesn't have a high degree of participation, or maybe any participation at all, is work together with a group of breeders, share rams, decide that this is something important. You want to improve your breed, not only on your own farm sheep, but you want to improve your breed. You can work together and you can optimize these numbers. Okay, you're a goat producer. Why would you enroll in the National Sheep Improvement Program? This is for sheep. Well, first of all, EBVs are equally beneficial to sheep and goat producers. There's really no difference between raising sheep and goats for wool, for fiber, or for meat. The goat industry can make the EBVs be what they want them to be. If they want a 90-day weaning weight instead of a 60, they can make it work for them. But the concepts are the same, the benefits are the same. Well, you don't like the terms ewe, ram, and lamb. Well, if we get enough goat producers to participate, I do believe that could change. I honestly believe that could change. Also, sheep genetics in Australia, besides lamb plan, they have kid plan. Maybe initially the goat data goes into lamb plan and you have all the lamb terminology, but if we get enough participants, we could use kid plan. The coordinator for the meat goats, I don't think we have any fiber goats in it, is Dr. Ken Andrews from Kentucky State University. So every breed has a coordinator, and goats have a coordinator. So Ken Andrews from Kentucky State University is a coordinator. If you're interested, I highly recommend that you contact him. Ken also does on-farm performance testing, where if you send him your data, he will calculate the adjusted weaning weights for you. But like I said, we have 5 meat goat herds. How can you use EBVs in your flock? Well, if you're a purebred producer, again, you could enroll your flock in NSIP and use the EBVs to improve your selection for traits that are important. Maybe you don't enroll your flock, but you purchase breeding stock, especially rams, with above average EBVs or indexes. So I'm not going to enroll my flock, but I want to get a really good ram, or I want to get a ram that excels in these traits. This works for if you're already enrolled, this is what you should do. If you're not enrolled, that's still a good idea to buy rams with EBVs. And if you're a small flock, you think you're too small, you think your numbers are going to be meaningless or too slow, again, this is a way to introduce performance into your flock. EBVs can also be used to establish values for your breeding stock. If you're a commercial producer, it's not really intended for commercial producers. Hopefully you're crossbreeding, and EBVs really aren't designed to deal with crossbreeding. But what you can do is you purchase males with above average EBVs or indexes. If I'm a commercial producer, commercial sheep producer, and I want to make money with sheep, I'm not going to buy just any old ram. I'm going to buy rams that have this performance data, that I have some confidence that I'm getting a ram that's going to improve the genetics. I can buy it direct from the breeder. You go onto the NSIP website and you can find individual breeders, or I'm going to go to one of the sales that sells NSIP animals, and I'll talk about that in a few slides. How would you actually use these numbers? Well, the most common way to use EBVs is to do what we call balanced selection, meaning I don't just select the one with the heaviest weaning weights or the best parasite resistance, but I select for a balance of traits based on what I'm interested in. I could choose animals that are above average in all traits. So I'm not looking for the highest in something, but above average in all traits, above that, above zero, either in percentage or pounds. And then I'm going to breed the best to the best. I'm not going to buy the best ram and then breed into my worst ewes. I'm going to breed the best ram to my best ewes. I can also use indexes to help me make selection decisions, depending on my breed, depending on my production system. So if I'm looking for a Suffolk ram to sire crossbred market lambs that I'm gonna sell when they weigh 130 pounds, I could use the terminal sire index, which is actually called the Carcass Plus. So it puts an emphasis on growth rate, it puts an emphasis on loin depth, it puts an emphasis on fat depth, and I'm sure there's some probably weaning weight or something else in there. And then we have the indexes for the maternal wool, hair, and range, which are again, different production systems, different breeds. An alternative way to use EBVs is single trait selection, where I focus on one or a small number of traits. This can be used to correct a problem in a flock. It can be used to create an elite flock. Maybe I wanted to create, an extremely parasite-resistant flock. Well, I might have to really focus in on that parasite-resistant trait for a few years, and it might come at the expense of some other traits. Selecting for one or two traits can be very risky, and we need to be very aware of unintended consequences, problems that may arise from this selection strategy. We've seen it in other industries. If I were to select for birth weight, maybe not so much in sheep, but in cattle, if I were to not select for birth weight, but select for post-weaning weight or yearling weight in the case of cattle, and kind of ignore birth weight, well, remember, they're very positively correlated. So as I increase yearling weight, I also increase my birth weight, and that led to calving difficulties. We've selected dairy cattle for very high levels of milk production. What has been the unintended consequence of that? They don't, and Jeff would be able to answer that better than me, but I think the consequence has been that they don't rebreed as well, they don't last as long in the herd. So for most cases, we want balanced selection, but there can be some unique situations where we might hone in on one or two traits. It's very important to match the production system and goals to EBVs. For example, if I sell 60-pound lambs, it's far more important for me to select for maternal weaning weight than for post-weaning weight. I'm not going to have them post-weaning. So I'm going to get my weight from the dam and from her milk production, and so I'm going to put the emphasis on maternal weaning weights. If I'm organic or pasture-based, parasite resistance is going to be very important, and I'm probably going to put some emphasis on that. If I'm feeding my lambs out in a feedlot, parasite resistance is just not very important. Depends on what breed I have. If I'm raising a terminal sire breed, a breed that's intended to produce market lambs for sale, example would be Suffolk, another example Hampshire, Texel, I'm going to put my emphasis on growth and carcass traits. Not necessarily the only traits, but there's definitely going to be strong emphasis on that. If I raise a maternal breed, again, Katahdin, Polypay, Dorset, lots of other breeds, I'm going to emphasize the reproductive traits: number of lambs born, number of lambs weaned, maternal weaning weights. Let's say I have a really productive flock, but I have a lot of orphans. Well, I probably am not going to select any more for number of lamb born, but I'm going to select maternal weaning weights. That's the way I select for milk production, and hopefully that'll help me reduce the number of orphan lambs. So you want to put some thought into your selection decision when you use EBVs. If you decide to do them, what do you need to measure? What do you need to record? Well, obviously date of birth, birth type, rear type, again, single, twin, triplet, sire and dam information, those contemporary or management groups. The program needs to know what animals are in the same contemporary group. Birth weight. Birth weight should be recorded within 24 hours of birth. Weaning weight. The average for most breeds is 60 days. Again, the goat producers could decide to make it 90. I believe it's 120 for Targhee, although I could be wrong. Breeds can make the data best suit them. So for a 60-day weaning weight, doesn't mean I'm going to wean them all when they hit 60 days of age, somewhere between 40 and 90 days. And then a post-weaning weight, somewhere between 90 and 150 days. That's usually 120 days. Okay? I must provide that data. Optional data would be fecal egg counts. This is a lot of emphasis is being put on this trait in the Katahdin breed, although not all Katahdin breeders do it. It's usually done after weaning, around 120 days of age. And there's some specific protocols for getting this data, because fecal egg count data, for example, is not very relevant if the animals haven't been challenged with parasites. You wouldn't do fecal egg count data if the lambs are in dry lot. We've got to make sure there's a sufficiently high challenge in order to get this data. Scrotal circumference, that's another reproductive trait that you can do EBVs on, and you can collect that data. Ultrasound scans, if I'm raising a terminal sire breed like Suffolk, like Hampshire, like Texel, this is definitely something I would want to do, but it can be done for all breeds. So there are some different things you can do. I left out fleece traits, because obviously if you're raising a wool breed, whether it's fine wool or coarse wool, those are definitely traits that you're going to want to measure. So you must do the ones on the left, or you should do the ones on the left, and there's a lot of other data that you can also collect depending on your goals and breed. How do you enroll your flock or herd in NSIP? Well, you go to the website. It's called nsip.org. A year or two ago, I don't think the website was very good, but a year or two ago, the sheep industry wanted to relaunch and rebrand NSIP, and part of that rebranding effort was a better website, better educational materials, better promotional materials, and to really make an effort to try to get more flocks in the program. It may not seem like there's a lot of flocks right now, but it is increasing, and there's a lot of excitement, I know, within the sheep industry to increase enrollment. And as somebody who conducts a buck test, I would really love to get the goat industry involved. So you go on the website, you print out this form, you fill it out, and you send it into NSIP. The first year enrollment fee is waived for first-time members and for younger people. If they're under 22, as of January 1st, then they get free enrollment for 3 years. You have to still write a check, even though the first year is free. They don't want people enrolling and then never entering data, so they have you write a check, and then as you enter data, that $100 counts against your data cost. And then you start, you'll hear from Lamplan or Australian Genetics and NSIP, and you'll start collecting and entering data. And once you reach that point, you know, that's a whole bunch more webinars. And there are mentors to help people with data. The software is free. You get the data back. They do 2-week runs, but there's a lot of educational materials if you decide to enroll and get started in it. But step one is downloading that enrollment form, filling it out, and sending it in. How much does it cost? Well, it's based on the size of your flock or herd. It's $100 plus $250 times the number of ewes or does you have, $25 if you have a second breed. It's capped at $400, and if you pay by January 1st of each year, you get a $25 early bird credit. So in my case, I have a flock of 40 ewes, and so that's $100 plus another $100, so it's $200 for my flock of 40 ewes. That's an annual enrollment. There's also a data fee, and it's based on the number of lambs or kids that you enter data with for past birth. Okay, so weaning weights, post-weaning weights. It's a little more complex than that, but that's basically what it is. The cost is $2.85 per animal. So you can start doing the math. It covers the lifetime of the animal, and you can mark a certain number of animals as culls or commercial, meaning they're not going into the breeding herd, and so you wouldn't have to pay $2.85 on that. But this is in very general what the cost is. Okay, so that's what it's going to cost me, or you think it can make you any money? Well, the primary purpose of EBVs is to make genetic improvements in your flock or herd, which ultimately leads to increased profitability. A couple of examples that I have here in the pink box. If you used a ram that had an EBV of +5 for number of lambs weaned, his daughter would be expected to produce 5% more lambs than the average. So if you had 100 lambings, 100 ewes, that would be 5 more lambs. So if I value those 5 lambs at $150, that's $750 more income that ram brought you. If you have a flock of 50, it's going to be $325. You guys can do the math. 100 was easy. So that ram is worth $750 more than the average. Okay? If I switch over to looking at weaning weight, if he has a +5 for weaning weight, and if you remember, the units for weaning weight are kilograms because the Australians use the metric system. So that's +5 kilograms. So his offspring are going to get half the genetics from him and half from their dam, so they're going to have an advantage of 5.5 pounds. Okay, so half of it was 2.5 kilograms, so we convert that to pounds and it's 5.5. So they're going to be 5.5 pounds heavier. Okay, so if I figure $2 a lamb, that's $11 a lamb. 50 lambs, that's $550. 100 lambs, that's $1,100. Again, you can do the math for the different numbers of lambs. EBVs do put money in your pocket. Okay, as a breeder, I think we're starting to see an increasing demand for sheep with EBVs. There's not that many sales. So you can sell them privately, but in terms of taking them to a sale, there's just a few. The Southwest Virginia ram test, not all the rams have EBVs, but those that do tend to sell at a premium, several $100s more than the rams that do not. The Center of the Nation sale in Iowa, that's a multi-breed sale. The Montana ram sale. They're talking about having an NSIP sale in the east, maybe in Ohio. Time will, I don't know if that'll come off or not. Goats, again, we've got only 5 herds. We got to get started, and once we get started, hopefully we can do some of the same things that the sheep industry is doing. Tips for making the NSIP and EBVs work for you: you have to collect the right data at the right time. I believe there's a question in the chat box about the fleece traits. There are specifications for, and I'm not necessarily sure exactly when they are, probably yearling stage, but right date at the right time. You need to put thought into your breeding groups and which ram goes with which and how you're going to manage those. You want to try to make sure you have good contemporary groups. So if I've got that 30 ewe flock I talked about, I don't want to put 25 ewes with one ram and 5 with the other. I want to try to create the most beneficial contemporary groups. It's best to cooperate with other NSIP breeders or to get more of your fellow breeders involved so that you can have those linkages so you can get meaningful data. Okay, you want to communicate with commercial producers. When you produce rams that have EBVs, commercial producers need to value those rams, and you need to let them know what you're doing and share that information with them. And I think producers who are serious about making money with sheep, making money with goats, do understand the importance of genetics, and EBVs can give them some confidence. If they just look at your animals and buy them, there's absolutely nothing that guarantees that animal is any good. EBVs gives them confidence. It's important to be honest. The other thing about genetics, not just EBVs, but genetics requires patience and trust. It will work. We have plenty of data that shows the effectiveness of quantitative genetic evaluation. Sometimes it takes a few years. You got to get those linkages established. You got to get this breeding plan. Okay, you may make changes in your management so you can get better benefits from EBVs. You need to be patient and you need to trust the data. You look at an animal and say, oh well, he's not as big as this one, but he's got better EBVs. Trust the data. All right, but what can and can't they do? Okay, they can help you make selection decisions, picking out your replacements. They can help you make purchasing decisions. Which ram am I going to buy? Culling decisions. Which ewes should I get rid of? Selecting your flock sires. They increase the accuracy of selection for superior performance. As a seed stock producer, they can set the value of your breeding stock. Ultimately, the goal is to increase the profitability of your enterprise, and ultimately EBVs can do that. They can also improve the productivity of a breed. We're not just talking about improving the genetics on your farm, but we improve the genetics of the breed. And I didn't put any graphs in this presentation, but we can show graphs of how the Katahdin breed has improved in number of lambs born and weaned. The same thing with the Targhee breed. We have compelling data that shows how powerful EBVs can do. In Australia, where they've been predominantly dependent on wool, they've shown where EBVs have really improved their lamb production and taken it to a whole new level. But EBVs can't do everything. They don't tell you if the lamb is structurally correct. Hey, if a three-legged lamb had an EBV of 10 for weaning weight, hey, that could happen. But it didn't tell you that he had only 3 legs. Can't tell you if he has good conformation. Yes, it can tell me if he has a deep loin, but not overall conformation. Can't tell me if he has good breed character. Can't tell me if he has a bad bite or a fleece defect. EBVs do not replace visual appraisal. You still need to look at the animal. I just think you do it in a different order. You look at the EBVs first, then look at the animal. Most of us tend to look at the animal first and then look at the records. We want the animals with the best EBVs, but then we want to look at them to make sure they meet our standards for structure, for soundness, for correctness. The other thing they can't do is they can't force you to make the right breeding decisions. You can have all the data in the world and it's very powerful, but you can also use it in a wrong way. Again, start selecting for a single trait like, I'm just saying, number born. Without milk production, that doesn't do you a lot of good, does it? So it can't make you make the right decision. It gives you the tools to make good decisions, though. This is a question that people often have. Are animals with EBVs better than animals without? Maybe, maybe not. EBVs will identify poor performing animals, and we hopefully will get rid of them. The animals that don't have EBVs could be genetically superior or inferior. We do not know. There is no way of knowing. It's like sending your kids to school without report cards. If you're not doing EBVs, you could have good sheep or good goats, but they could be good because simply you're a good manager. I raise Katahdin sheep, and I don't have a parasite problem. But when people buy from me, I tell them, don't you for a minute assume that my Katahdins are any better or worse than anyone else's in terms of parasites. I have found a production system that works for me, but I don't have any genetic data on how my animals are with parasite resistance. Okay? Don't let anybody tell you so-and-so animals are parasite resistant. If you don't measure it, you don't know and you can't manage it. So that's the difference. It's between knowing and not knowing. EBVs tell us what we got, and they're going to tell us a lot of our stuff is crap. But they're going to identify the good performers, and we're going to breed the best of the best, and we're going to keep elevating that level in our flock, elevating that level in our breed. There's a lot of information about EBVs and NSIP online. I included these websites in another email, but here they are again. The National Sheep Improvement Program has lots of good information. Katahdin breeders have formed their own group, and they have a lot of really good information on there. You don't have to be a Katahdin breeder to benefit from the information they have on their website. NSIP recently came out with a ram buying guide. It's fresh off the press. Helps you set goal. Basically, it helps you identify the performance level in your flock to set goals and to give you guidance on selecting rams. Unfortunately, we can't really do this with goats yet. You can enroll your herd in NSIP, but if you're a commercial producer and would like to buy bucks with EBVs, they're really not available yet. We've got to get a critical mass of goat producers in there so that they can purchase a buck for breeding. And then there's the website of Sheep Genetics Australia, of Lamb Plan.